Hi, welcome to OST Shop Tutorial Sessions. I'm Micah and today we're going to be working on a 2016 Scat Pack. It's completely stock right now with 3,500 miles. We're going to be doing a unlock PCM installation, and then we're also going to install a Innovate Wideband O2 sensor and gauge with one of our custom mounts. So let's get into it. So I've already got the cover panel off. And we're going to remove the PCM now. Careful you don't drop them down in there because it is tough to get them back out. Get this guy out, slide the bracket off. I like to tape up the strut brace to avoid scratching it. Connectors off. Top one you can get off while it's still in the car. Lift it up. Grab the second one. Something you'll want to do before you take the new one out of the box, just in case, is mark the old one so you don't get them mixed up. And I'll actually mark the new one as well. Gotta swap this little rubber thing over. See it all the time and it's almost never swapped over. So now we're putting it back in. The reason we're putting the PCM in first before we do the wideband or anything else like that is if we have issues, we won't be able to tune the car. So this is the most important thing. We want to make sure this is right. Alright. So for some of you guys, before I put this back on, got to make sure that when you take it off, there either is or is no hood prop, I don't know, sensor here. That's where it goes. Sometimes cars have it, sometimes they don't. This one does not, but if it did, you'd want to make sure you put that on before you put this bracket on because it's kind of tough to reach your hand down there and get it otherwise. Alright, now we'll follow the instructions that are in the box and make sure the PCM works. So we've got our key. And what we're going to do is ignition on, ignition off, we'll do that again, on, off, and we'll fire it up. We'll want to test for throttle, make sure that works, and we'll also want to make sure that we have no check engine lights or anything like that from an improper VIN or something else along those lines. Okay. No check engine lights. No ESC or stability control lights on. And the throttle works. So that was a successful PCM unlock and installation. Now we'll get onto the wideband. Alright, so we're going to get onto the wideband installation. We use the Innovate kit. This is a 3796 with a red gauge. So what we're going to do is install the O2 sensor into one of the rear factory O2 sensor bungs, so we don't have to weld another bung in. You can weld another bung in, but we're tuning this car anyway. This gentleman has no emissions in his county, so there's no need for the rear O2 sensors anyway. It makes this for a really simple installation. We're going to go up through a hole in the firewall right by the brake master cylinder, and let's get started. Alright, this is the rear O2 sensor we're taking out. We're doing it on the driver's side. And then you don't want to install yours yet, final, but we will do a test fit because it needs to be out of the exhaust for the free air calibration. So we're just going to put it in just to make sure we have the lengths of all of our wires correct and whatnot. Doesn't have to be all the way in. Just checking lengths. Alright. So we'll leave that there and then we'll lower the car down. And the rest of it on. All right, so now we're gonna get the cable that goes from the O2 sensor to the control module inside the car. This end here goes to the sensor, and this end here goes to inside the car. We're gonna drop it down beside the frame rail and underneath the brake booster and master cylinder. And then there's a pre-cut hole in the firewall back there where there's a bit of harness going through already. So we're actually just gonna tap into that current harness and run this through. We wanna make this appear as if it's factory. So follow factory harnesses when you can. And then this end's gonna go in the car. So we dropped it down beside the frame rail. Now we're gonna open up that grommet and harness and go inside the car. All right, so the cable is run through the grommet on the firewall. Now we need to take this panel off so that we can drop the lower kick panel. And then we'll be able to do our wiring, and then we'll actually disassemble the steering wheel and whatnot to mount the gauge. If you've seen any of our pictures online, the gauge mounts up here. So first thing to get off is this. They can be kind of difficult. You definitely need one of these tools. Without these, it's nearly impossible. So we'll just slowly start working our way around it. So now there's a bolt here and a bolt here. You have the option of accessing this bolt with a wrench or taking this panel off. Sometimes they pop off nicely and sometimes they don't. So I have my wrench here just in case that happened. I'll get this lower bolt out. All right, so we got our bolts out here. The rest of this lower panel is held on by clips similar to the ones here. So you just have to slowly go along and give them a soft but firm tug and they'll pop out. Sometimes these little white clips pop out, but they slide right back on. So there's some along the bottom, and then there's some going this way along the top here. Those are the most frustrating to pop out. There we go. All right, so with this panel removed, you can get all of these wires off. The only thing that you can't really access super easily is the emergency or the hood cable here. On the older cars, it's the emergency brake cable, but same concept. I usually just leave it on and let this kind of sit where it lies. So now we're going to take this lower steel panel off. The 15-16 cars are pretty similar to the old ones. It's the same 4 10mm bolts. We'll remove this, and then we can work on getting the steering wheel apart. And we're also going to remove the center console here, but we'll do that at a later date. So before we get the center console and center stack out, you're going to remove this center trim panel around the shifter. It has smaller clips on it. These are easily the most frustrating ones. So take your time, work your way around with your tool. It is difficult, but you can do it. So after we have popped this up, we're going to remove this 4-wire connector. So you're going to pinch the clip back. Ooh. Pinch it here to pull it out of the connector, and then we're going to lift this up as high as we can. We're going to try to get to the Torx head bolt right here to actually remove the shifter itself. You don't need to do all of this. It just makes it a whole lot easier to get the center stack out. So it just slides right off. Set that carefully over here. Alright, so now we can get the center console and center stack out. So we just have to pop these clips carefully and gently. Alright, and then there's some wires behind here. So we'll pull that out. And then this one will set carefully over here as well. Okay, so now we've gotten all that disassembled. You can see here the automatic transmission neutral engagement lever for emergencies. So the wires we're going to get into are for the cigarette lighter, and they're actually on this big connector here. So we'll pop that off the securing tab. Okay, so we're going to use this connector here. The power wire is going to be this big fat pink with a yellow tracer, and the ground will be the big fat black wire. I like to tap into them up here on the upper side of the connector. You can do upper or lower, it really doesn't matter. But what I do is, and you'll see, we'll actually put a connector on here so that it can be removed and this harness can come out, or the wideband module can be removed if you ever need to do that. You never really want to make permanent changes and just solder them directly to those wires. So we're checking for ignition power at the wires I was talking about, just in case. You never really want to just tap into wires, even though you've done it 100 times, just every time you want to check. So I have my probe in, and we're going to a ground, and I'm going to ignition on. Right now, obviously there's no power. So accessory and run both have power, which is what we want. Checking for ohms now. You want previous ground and the ground that we want to use. Sure enough, it's a ground, so we're good. Pink with the yellow tracer and black. So we have these covered spade connectors on here so that the module can be removed or the harness can be removed if you ever wanted to service any of this. So we're going to wire in our Innovate control module, and we're also going to wire in the harness for the gauge, which is going to go up to the steering wheel. So we're going to pair the two powers, the grounds, and then on the gauge, this yellow wire could be a dimmer, or if you're not using it for a dimmer, you're going to wire it to ground. With the way the headlights are set up on these cars, it's very, very difficult, and I don't even know if it's possible to actually put a dimmer on it. I'm sure someone could figure it out. The brown wire is for a narrowband signal, so we're actually going to cut that because we don't need it, and the yellow is going to be our signal, which we will pair with the white wire on the gauge harness. We had to run the harness for the gauge up through the underside of the center console so we can bring it up next to the module. So we've got our ground paired with our headlight dimmer / ground for the gauge harness, and then for the module we've got to pair that ground with it as well. This is all going to the ground that we made right here. Alright, so the way I like to do this is so that you can't ever plug it in wrong. I have a male spade connector on the ground and a female spade connector on the positive, so you just make sure that you're putting the female spade connector on this ground. That just helps it so that you never, when someone else is putting this back together, they don't do it backwards. Okay, and now for the signals. So we want to connect the yellow output signal on the wideband module to the white on the gauge module. Now, I also like to throw in an extra step in here. Instead of just putting these together on a butt connector, I'm actually going to twist them together like this and put either a male or female covered spade connector on it. So the signal will still get to the gauge, but if you ever want to connect your wideband signal to an HP Tuners Pro module, you won't have to do any wiring. It'll be an open spade connector ready to go. So we actually mount the gauge behind the steering wheel. I think it looks a lot cleaner than a pillar gauge. But to do that, we need to remove the steering wheel, and to do that, we actually need to remove the airbag center section. This can be really difficult for the first time you do it, but once you get the hang of it and you get the feel for it, you'll do it easier. So there's a little hole on each side, right here. So you get any sort of pin that's about the same size. I like to use an Allen wrench. Put it in there, and you're feeling for the spring. And I'll show you what that looks like once we get it off, but you're feeling for the spring on the inside here. Okay, so before we take the airbag out, you'll need to disconnect the battery. That will make the horn not go off when you're messing with it, and when you go to disconnect the airbag, it won't go off in your face. So with the airbag disconnected from the springs, you'll need to disconnect the horn and the airbag wires. So that's both of these yellow connectors, and then the horn connector is this one up top. It just slides out. It doesn't have a little clip or anything on it. So you need to be careful with these airbag ones. You don't want to break them. To get these airbag connectors off, these orange tabs, you gotta work in there with a screwdriver, pop them the whole way up. Again, make sure your battery's disconnected, and then you pop them off. When you're working with those, that Allen head or any sort of poking tool on the backside, what you're trying to do is get in through this slot here in the side, and your tool's going to be kind of like my finger, and you're trying to push this spring to release it. Next thing we're going to do is remove the steering wheel. Before you do that, there's a couple electrical connections. So there's this big connector right here, simple clip, pulls that off, and then there is this white connector as well, same concept. So to remove the steering wheel, there's a Allen bolt in this very center here. It's spring loaded. It's also pretty tight. So it's actually spring loaded. The whole wheel is spring loaded. So as I'm loosening this, the wheel actually is being pushed off of the steering column, which is kind of cool. And then we'll remove the steering wheel itself carefully. You got to make sure you can get the airbag wires through the slots in the back. Don't want to rip those off. So now we have to break this seam. So there's there's actually three pieces of plastic. There's this leather piece that connects here, there's the center piece, and then there's this outer shell. So we're actually going to be mounting the gauge to this rearmost facing outer shell. Alright, so taking this outer ring off, the easiest way to do it is actually squeeze and pinch this back side here. When you squeeze it, you should be able to pop it off like that. Alright, so I've marked it where I want the gauge to go. We're going to go drill the holes and get the gauge mounted, and then we'll run the wires, which are in the back side here, and get going on it. Now I'm getting the cable for the O2 sensor that we fed into the car earlier, and I'm going to route it to the O2 sensor, or the Innovate control module, wideband module. We're going to go under the dash and out into the center console. So now this goes to our O2 sensor. And then we have our control module right here. So what I'm going to do, before I button up all this and make it all nice and neat, is I'm going to put the connect the O2 sensor to this. We're going to do our free air calibration, and then we're actually going to hook the gauge up and just test the gauge, make sure everything works, make sure we're getting a good signal, and then we'll put it all back together and make it nice. So let's put the car back up in the air. Alright, so we've got our battery hooked back up. The first step in the free air calibration is to leave the O2 sensor disconnected from the module and turn the key on and let it sit with ignition on for 30 seconds. So, foot off the brake, ignition on, we'll do that now. So it's going to show an error code, but that's natural. It's just saying there's no O2 sensor hooked up, so we'll let that sit. Alright, so that was the 30 seconds. Ignition back off. Now we have our O2 sensor in free air. You do not want it in the exhaust because it'll calibrate it for whatever leftover exhaust gases are sitting in your exhaust. So you leave it in free air. We're going to hook it up. Now we'll do ignition on, and they say this one's for 2 minutes, but you're just going to leave it on until the sensor warms up. That'll vary. When the sensor warms up, this will stop blinking green, it'll go solid green, and your gauge will read 22.4. or 22.1. So ignition on. So the blinking green means that it's warming the sensor up. If you have a red showing now that your sensor is hooked up, that means you've wired something incorrectly, pinched wires or maybe a bad sensor. So we'll let that sit until the sensor warms up. So you can see now it's not blinking. It says 7.5, 7.4. That means it's just warming up, but it's not blinking. So that's going well. All right, so we've gone solid green on the module here. And our gauge is showing 22.4. So we have successfully calibrated the free air. Now we can put that sensor in the exhaust, fire it up, and it should sit around 14.7, 14.6. But we're gonna do ignition off and get this all buttoned up, make it all look nice and neat. Something you do have to be very careful not to do is now that you've calibrated it for free air, if you do put your sensor back in the exhaust and you have this disconnected because you're wiring it up and everything, and you fire the car up, it will recalibrate itself for the exhaust gas as free air. It'll think that's free air and it'll really throw you off. So just make sure that you connect it. You don't turn the car back on with the O2 sensor disconnected and then plug it back in and turn the car back on again. You want to leave it all disconnected until you hook everything back up, and then you can reconnect the battery, turn it on, and you should still have that calibration. Okay, so here we have everything all hooked up. Everything's back together, plastics are all in the car, center console's in, shifter's back in, and the wideband gauge is mounted. It's warming up right now, and we're all done.